Welcome to the Mindful Academy podcast with me, Jennifer Askey. I'm a professional certified coach and academic workplace consultant. On this podcast, I talk about doing well personally so that you can perform well professionally. I talk about intentional career planning and about how to get out of your own way and align yourself with success. Thank you for joining me. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Mindful Academy. I'm Jennifer Askey. I'm your coach. And today I'm going to be talking about a few ways we get in our own way. So, as I'm sure I've mentioned before, I was a professor in my first real full-time career. I was a professor of German literature, got tenure. And if I knew then what I know now, right, I made life really hard on me. And I've been thinking a little bit about how I might have done things differently if I'd had a coach or if I had learned a little bit more about like the business of being a professor and how to be successful at that job and the business of like being a grown-up who can manage her mind and regulate her emotions. And so I'm going to talk about three things that I saw as sort of repeating patterns in my first career as a professor and what I run into in a lot of my clients, and talk about how they show up and how you might resist those if they are showing up in your life. So first one, over preparing. How do you walk in to a classroom or a conference session or a presentation? What does preparation mean to you? Does it mean reams of notes, a fully scripted lecture, PowerPoints that practically do it on their own and don't even need you in the room? The ability, and this is something I hear a lot from my clients when we talk about how much time they spend preparing classes. Like, well, what if I get presented with a question I don't have the answer for in the moment? So there's sort of this anticipatory fear of being caught out and the desire to prepare for all of that. And hand in hand with that, a slightly different phenomenon is the professor who owes it to the students to provide them with the best possible experience in the classroom, regardless of how much time and energy that takes. So this is obviously, it's perfectionism, but it's rooted in fear, right? It is rooted in fear of something going horribly wrong and you being blamed or you feeling the blame. And what I suggest as a way to practice resisting this, if you find that like all of your time is being gobbled up by something that you're over preparing for, whether it's over preparing for class or seriously like over preparing for writing emails to people, right? Where you draft it and draft it again and draft it again and draft it again. Or you have 87 folks look at your article before you submit it, or your abstract before you submit it. Like this, I need more information. I need more in order to perform. If you find that being you and you think, oh man, this is taking more time than it should, and I'm not sure I'm getting the ROI for all of this extra invested time, right? That isn't actually giving you a return on your investment of time and energy. One strategy for resisting that is experimentation. And so I think of this as like act and learn. And I'm not talking about applying this wholesale in every area of your life, but pick something, right? So for my clients who spend as much time prepping a class as they do teaching a class, an area of experimentation can be getting curious around what is the necessary outcome of the class for the students, right? Learning objectives that feed into the curriculum, accomplishing a certain task, getting familiar with a certain concept, right? Getting curious about like, what's the real outcome here? And what are ways to achieve that in the moment? What are ways of achieving that where you, as the professor, are not doing all of this behind the scenes work to prepare, and then again, in person, all of the work, and then holding yourself accountable for all of the outcomes? Because what's happening there is that you are working like 3 times harder than the students. And you are the subject matter expert. You have already gone through that class. You took it as an undergrad. You mastered it. You went on to graduate school. You teach it now. You should not be putting in 3 times as much effort as the students. Yes, you're performing a different skill, but if you are, and I had a coach use the word efforting with me recently. Like, is that a word? I'm not sure that it's a word, but it kind of fits right here. If you are efforting so much more than the students, how might you experiment with giving them the work? Giving them the work so that they're doing the growing, right? As opposed to you going over and over and over a path that you've been down before, right? In a way that is time intensive, but not rewarding. So how do you work with the students, partner with the students to get where you're going? For example, this applies to marking as well. Like at the end of the semester when it's grades season and all you're doing is grading things and calculating and putting stuff up. How might you reduce the amount of time that takes, right? Are students going to pick up those final papers? Do students bring home their final projects? Are they going to build on them? Is a cumulative grade, right? Is a grade on that project fine without your brilliant narrative, right? What is the fear that's prompting this? What's the sense of completionism that you're battling against? And how might you say, okay, what are they getting out of it? What am I getting out of it? And if I'm spending so much more effort than the students are, if I'm spending so much more effort than my calendar allows, how might I experiment with, try something different, see what I learn, right? Act and learn. Recognizing that unless you're doing like cardiac surgery, death is unlikely to result from a mistake. So how might you experiment with cutting yourself some slack, offloading some of the work to the students, deferring some of that like really intense feedback for students who will never take advantage of it, right? This comes up a lot in class prep in the people I work with, but I think you can extrapolate it to other areas of your life. Where are you over preparing? And how might you reduce your effort and get the same ROI? And so maybe you need to put on a different hat to do that. Maybe you need to imagine yourself as somebody else for a minute. Maybe you need to flip things upside down and plan from the end instead of planning from the beginning and like working yourself up to the final product. What if you start with thinking about, okay, this is what I want the final product to look like, and then planning a few basic steps backwards so that you offer your brain fewer opportunities to be super completionist about everything, right? The other area I see over preparation is when you're doing a research project, and I'm more familiar with the social sciences and humanities here, and somebody suggests, okay, you need to read this, this, and this. Fine, you go read those things, and then you follow the footnotes there, and you go read their sources, and then you go read their sources, and then you go read their sources, because what if, right? When often the request to, you need to take this secondary literature into account, often you can get how that secondary literature applies to your argument without reading every word, without reading every footnote, right? Targeted reading. What am I trying to get out of this? Is it just a chapter that really addresses my argument? If I read the abstract, do I have a sense of how this is going to apply to my argument? And can I target my effort here? Or am I operating out of fear and think that I have to not only read every word of this article, but also every word of everything it cites, so that I could reproduce that work on a moment's notice, rather than I've read this and I know how it applies to what I'm doing, but I am not capable of reproducing that person's scholarship. So this tendency to overinvest time and over prepare and be completionist about everything shows up a lot. And it's a way to, it's just getting in the way of what you're meant to be doing, the impact you're meant to be having, whether it's in scholarship or in the classroom. So the second way that I see people getting in their own ways, and this was me 110%, reinventing the wheel. Okay. Sometimes I think of this as having a low boredom threshold, quest for novelty. Sometimes it shows up as like a restlessness where like, oh, I've hit the surface of that. Now let's go hit the surface of something else. So there's a lot of like hits of novelty without maybe a ton of depth. And the way this showed up for me, and I remember the day it occurred to me when I realized what I was doing that nobody else was doing. I taught an upper class, so like third and fourth year student literature course that was required for the major. And it had a nice vague description, right? German literature after World War II, or maybe it was German novellas, short stories. I can't quite remember. But there's a ton to choose from. And for the first 3 or 4 years I was on the tenure track, every time I taught it, I picked a different theme. So that every semester I taught it, got to read half a dozen new books, plan a bunch of new lessons, design, right? And it was fun for me because I got to get deep into new material and I didn't reteach the same stuff. What I realized one day, talking to a professor in a different department who had a very different teaching load than I did, right? She taught the same 2 classes in rotation and just refreshed her notes, refreshed her memory, and lather, rinse, repeated. And I was like, people do that? And I was just shocked, like seriously blown away that I could reteach something. Every undergrad class was like teaching a brand new graduate seminar, right? It had to be new and exciting for me and maybe on the edge of what I was working on. And while I got a lot out of that, it wasn't very strategic, right? Because here I am over here trying to do my research, and that takes time and effort and maybe some travel and close reading and drafting and all of that. I was doing things that were maybe related or maybe not over here in the classroom that took, again, a ton of time. And the students in 2007 and the students in 2010 did not need different material. If we're looking at literature from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, like, I could teach the same books because they were a different group of students. And it blew my mind that I could do that. But what I noticed today, coaching people, is the urge to reinvent the wheel shows up in different ways for different folks. But this notion of like, well, every semester it has to be a brand new class, or I really need to refresh this, right? I'm going to refresh this class every so often. And, if you're teaching something that really is of the moment, maybe that makes sense. But if you're teaching a methods class or a literature class, right, there's all sorts of things where you need to tweak 10%, maybe 20%, but you don't need to reinvent the wheel. The other way that I see reinventing the wheel show up is in research. The worry maybe that some people have that if what they're putting out there isn't groundbreaking, doesn't establish a new field on its own, that it is insufficient. And so the tension between being a contributor to a scholarly conversation and being like a guru shows up as, for me, like reinventing the wheel. Everything I write has to break entirely new ground versus like, I'm really good at this thing. How might I repurpose that? How might I dig deeper on that? How might I take one success and sort of turn it on its side, turn it upside down, play with it a little bit so that I'm getting the benefit of increased interaction with something. I go deeper with it by looking at it from different facets instead of just like, well, it has to be brand new and amazing every time I put my pen to paper, right? And what the the resistance for this, like how to resist this, again, isn't go whole hog and do this for everything, right? Because if you have a pattern of I'm going to reinvent the wheel this time because that's what I do, because being absolutely novel and unique is super important to me, then pick one thing and say, okay, what if I kaleidoscope this, right? What if I break it into pieces and shift it a bit? What comes out there? Can I make a different argument? Can I make a new observation? Can I speak into a different scholarly conversation with something that I'm already deeply familiar with? And I think that the sciences do a better job of this than the social sciences and humanities, right? Because the sciences understand that like this little nugget can be an article. This little nugget can be an article, and those nuggets are all part of a bigger picture. And at least from where I sit and what I see now with scholars coming into coaching with me is that it hasn't changed much from when I was doing literary scholarship, where like you need to be able to paint a really super thorough picture, and the next picture has to be drastically different. And yet I know scholars in the humanities and social sciences who are working in one type of painting, and they keep returning to it and moving it around. And you're not going to do that for decades, right? But can you do it a couple times before you move to the next thing, right? Give yourself time to sink in and go deep. There's sort of a corollary to this, which is the restlessness of resisting going deep, liking the quick hit of the novel and resisting staying still and going deep. And so there's an invitation to yourself to say, where is it worth stopping and going deep, right? Whether it's with a method or with a source, with an idea, where is it worth going deep? So that you learn more. Maybe there's less of the treadmill of activity and a little bit more, sinking into it. How might that give you a return on your time and your investment of time that is different from bouncing from one thing to the other and churning out a quick hit here and there, right? So reinventing the wheel offers the invitation to stop and shift, or stop and dig deeper, right? Instead of just rushing to the next thing. The third way that I see a lot of clients getting in their own way, and I think I can recall ways that this showed up for me in my early years as a professor, was a type of hypervigilance or catastrophizing that is kind of contagious and is very easy to fall into, especially if you are surrounded by people who gleefully recount all of the things that are broken and all of the ways things that can go wrong, right? That's a very contagious mindset. And we want to be able to show that we too are aware of how broken things are and how horribly things can go awry. The way that gets in the way of having the career you want to have and having the kind of impact you want to have, whether that's pedagogical or scholarly or leadership-wise, is, first of all, it can result in analysis paralysis or fatalism, right? It's also borked, whatever the process is, whether we're talking about monograph publishing or internal promotion and tenure review or whatever, right? If we think, oh, it's also borked, it isn't even worth trying, right? So there's a lot of just nihilism around, is it worth it? If it's going to be difficult, if it's a broken process, if it is unfair, right? So how do we hold ourselves back because we see the flaws in whatever system we're looking at. There's also in the accounting for every possible mishap, every possible way things can go wrong. We do what my former ski instructor friend, so a friend of mine who is a former ski instructor and is now a leadership development professional. We were talking about this and she said, yeah, it's like when you're learning to ski, if you look at the trees, you will run smack into them. And in mindfulness work, there is a lot of research and a lot of exploration of how our internal frameworks help shape our reality. And so if you are focused forever on all of the ways something could go wrong, you are heightening your attunement to the things that go wrong, right? You become hyper aware of all of the things that are wrong. You are more able and more readily fixated upon those things because that framework is so present in your mind. By the same token, if you assumed good intentions, if you assumed good intent on your part, on the part of the system, it's not trying to be horrible, right? How might that alter the way you show up to the work, right? So if you're catastrophizing and you sit down to do whatever it is that you're working on, and all you can feel is the dread of how things may go wrong, how is that impacting your work in the moment, right? Versus if you assume good intent, if you assume good intentions, does that affect your energy when you enter the work? I would argue, yes, of course, it affects your energy when you enter the work. What action do you take when you assume the worst? What action do you take when you assume the best? Or when you assume neutral, right? So think about, like, are you staring at the trees while speeding downhill? Or are you looking up? Are you imagining how is this going to work out well for me? How am I bringing really good stuff into being that will obviously find a good home, right? So what energy do you bring to the process, and how is that influenced by your mindset, right? Around possibility. And again, these are really entrenched habits of mind, right? If you're a perfectionist, if you are intellectually restless, if you are hypervigilant, these are not bad, right? They have strengths. Each of these ways of being in the world gives you certain things. But if you find them getting in your way, how do you shift out of them? How do you practice that shift from here's my default and I'm seeing where that doesn't really serve me, right? So the restlessness, right? The reinventing the wheel, the bouncing from thing to thing. You are an agile thinker, right? You're super curious. You're eager to learn. That's great fun, right? It might be getting in your way if you find that you don't stick with something long enough to see it through to completion. You may find it gets in your way if you have a bunch of, projects where maybe you've contributed something, you've churned something out, but it feels half finished, right? So if it's getting in your way like that, right? If it's obstructing your success as you define it in some way, how might you shift? Well, the condensed version, so all of the strategies for resistance, if I wanted to boil them down, it would be curiosity. Get curious. Don't assume that because it has happened once in a certain way, it will happen that way over and over and over and over again until the end of time. Be curious. And be curious about what is within your zone of control, right? If I think about things differently, if I approach things differently, if I try this experiment, right? If I recognize the emotion and say, yep, feeling that way, still gonna do it, right? What is within your control? Second thing, prioritization, right? How might, whether it's being completionist and perfectionist or being restless and easily bored, or being hyper vigilant and super cautious, how might all of those things respond to a stronger sense of prioritization, where not everything is equally essential, because it isn't, right? Not everything is equally essential. So how might it respond to saying, here are my 3 priorities for this semester. Here are my 3 priorities for this year, right? Depending on how big your projects are. How might prioritization give you permission to give some things a lot of energy and other things enough, right? And prioritization is a hard one because everything looks equally important. I see that like in my life every single day. It all looks equally important. And it's not. But how do we remind ourselves of what really is our priority so that we can gauge where our time and where our energy goes? Another TLDR strategy, compassion and empathy. Self-compassion in, this is hard for me, whatever my challenge is. And that's okay. Everybody has hard things. We share as humans the plight of the hard at least 50% of the time. And how recognizing that we share in the plight of the difficult really pushes back against the isolation that these fear-based strategies create, right? Because if you're worried about perfectionism and completionism, and if you're worried about constantly being new and always having something new going on, and you're hyper vigilant about the way things can go awry, like all of those things are deeply rooted in fear, right? Deeply rooted in imposter syndrome, or in that feeling of, in the same sort of inner critic voice that gives rise to the imposter syndrome. They're not the same thing, but how might compassion push back against the isolation of fear? Right, recognizing it in yourself, recognizing it in others. And empathy, by the same token, everybody was once an 8-year-old, right? Everybody once wanted to climb trees, or was afraid of the water, or had to learn how to do something that was really challenging. Everybody once was really excited about something and super enthused. And now as professionals, maybe they're too cool for school and everything is a critique and nobody's having any fun because we're all very dour and serious, but we all have an inner 8-year-old. We all have an inner precious child. And so as you approach other people, right, if you lead with that inner critic, that fear, right, and your judgment of yourself is front and center, we feel that. Everybody feels that. And that invites other people's inner judgment and inner critique to come to the fore. And then we have like our inner critics talking to each other and we're not having a good time. So if you come with compassion for yourself and empathy for the other person that recognizes that underneath all of the brilliance, we're humans, right? And that some of what we do as academics is putting on a very elaborate play, right? How do we connect as people on an empathic level and build that personal kind of trust that helps us develop more enthusiasm for our work, be more courageous about putting things out there, right? So self-compassion and empathy have a huge role to play in getting out of our own way, because the ways we get in our way are the ways of the inner critic, right? The inner critic just beating the crap out of us. And we all know that the inner critic is not our friend. So I hope that was interesting and helpful for you today. I find myself thinking about it a lot as I work with my clients lately, and wanted to share that with you. I will be back again soon with more from the Mindful Academy, and I look forward to hearing your feedback on this episode. Jennifer@jenniferaskey.com. Email me, and you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm posting a lot there because it seems a little bit cleaner, shall we say, than Facebook or Twitter. And I guess I put Instagram under Facebook, although I am there to It's far more informal. So have a lovely day. I'm glad you let me spend a little bit of time with you, and I look forward to seeing you or hearing you soon. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Mindful Academy podcast. For questions about this episode, suggestions for future episodes, or to request a consultation with me, email me at jennifer@jenniferaskey.com. This episode was recorded in Edmonton, Alberta on Treaty 6 lands. The songs included in the intro and outro for this podcast are Heartache by Silent Partner and Piano Store by Jimmy Fontanez of Media Right Productions, both sourced through the audio library. Thank you so much for listening.